On these last few slides, we're going to learn about John B. Watson, what he studied, and how he contributed to behaviorism. John Broadus Watson was an American psychologist who is known as the founder of behaviorism. Remember that although he wasn't the first behaviorist, he was the perspective's loudest promoter. He did the most for expanding behaviorism. Watson's childhood experiences were very different from those of the other psychologists we've learned about in this class. He was born in South Carolina in a poor family. His parents were very religious and wanted him to be a preacher. He later in life became an atheist. His father was an alcoholic and left the family when the kids were young. They moved to a different part of South Carolina, and Watson really struggled in school. He got in fights, he did not make very good grades, and many of the people from his early life did not think he would be successful. He did eventually get into Furman University, but he continued to struggle even in college. But these challenges did not stop him. He earned his PhD in 1903 from the University of Chicago. He studied with the early functionalists, Dewey and Angel. At the time, functionalism was very popular at this particular university. Many of the functionalists were also studying comparative psychology. They were studying animal behavior. His dissertation focused on baby rats. He noticed that in the first few weeks of life, baby rats really don't learn a whole lot. They're focused on developing, not so much on learning how to run through a maze. After a few weeks, though, the rats become more trainable. They become more responsive to the stimuli, the rewards, the consequences. In 1907, he and Harvey Carr taught rats how to run through different mazes. At the end of a maze was a piece of food. Over time, Watson and Carr noticed that the rats would make their maneuvers through the maze almost reflexively, automatically, like they weren't even thinking about it. They concluded that the rats were responding not to the external environment, not to external stimuli, but they were forming kinesthetic associations as they learned the maze. So the rats would remember how far they had to run before they turned left, how far they had to run to turn right, and so on. The rats learned the body movements required to get to the end of the maze. They weren't responding to the environment. They were responding to this association that developed within them, this association between the brain and the body. If the maze was somehow changed, like one of the alleyways was shortened, the rats would run straight into the wall. They could clearly see there was a wall right in front of them, but they were so used to running straight in that alleyway and taking the turn later on down the hallway, they ran right into the wall and made a kerplunk sound. Sometimes these studies are called the kerplunk studies because of the noise the rats made when they ran into the wall. He ended up at Johns Hopkins University in 1908 to take over the psychology department. Over the next few years, he worked with several different researchers. He actually worked with Robert Yerkes from Applied Psychology. They studied different animal species and their sensory capabilities. They mostly looked at visual perception. When he went to Florida for a few months, he studied the imprinting behavior of an animal species called terns. I have a picture here of a baby tern. It's a type of bird. There are several different species in Florida, and he was interested in how these birds imprint on their parents. Some of you might be familiar with geese and ducks imprinting on their owners. He also studied what is called instinctual drift in these animals. This is when an animal's instincts take over any type of learned behavior, any type of conditioned behavior. For instance, with Pavlov's dogs, sometimes the dogs would revert back to their natural state, their natural way of doing things. Sometimes when he rang the bell, they did not salivate. It did not happen 100% of the time. That's because we're talking about complex animals. It doesn't happen 100% of the time. When an animal reverts back to their instinctual nature, we call this instinctual drift, drifting back to those innate animal instincts, as opposed to the response that we train the animal to exhibit. In 1913, Watson published the founding article of behaviorism. He called it Psychology as a Behaviorist Views It. In this article, he criticized structuralism, functionalism, and especially introspection. He called for psychologists to use more objective methods, to use more scientific methods to study human psychology. He also said that there was no distinction between animals and humans, that it was perfectly acceptable to study animal behavior and then draw conclusions about human behavior. He said that although the behaviors look different, for instance, cats and dogs chase other animals up trees and humans don't do that, although the behaviors look different, the process of acquiring them and getting rid of them is the same. The goal for Watson and other behaviorists was to predict behavior, control behavior by controlling the environment. By making changes to the environment, we could cause changes to the individual. In 1914, Watson was elected APA president. One of the reasons I like to share the APA presidencies is because it gives us an indication of when these people were popular. In 1914, Watson was well known in the United States, so well known that his colleagues chose him to be their representative. In the 1910s, Watson became interested in emotions. In 1917, he and J.J.B. Morgan published the results of one of their emotional development studies. They looked at infants and observed how they respond to different stimuli and how their emotional responses to these stimuli are conditioned. They identified 3 types of human emotional responses to stimuli: fear, rage, and love. When the babies were afraid, they cried a lot and blinked their eyes. They usually did this when Watson presented some type of loud noise or when the infants were left alone. They weren't really left alone, but the babies thought they were alone. Rage included things like hitting, kicking, stiffening of the body. You know, kids do that sometimes. They usually responded this way when Watson wrapped them up or held down their arms and their legs. Love included smiling and cooing and eye contact, looking the other individual in the eyes. Babies usually responded in this way when they were talked to, when the tone was nice and calm, when they were gently, touched on the cheek, patted, rocked by another person. They documented the different situations, the different stimuli that resulted in these responses. Several years later, in 1920, he and one of his graduate students, Rosalie Rayner, published the results of their Little Albert study. They were focused on how fear is conditioned, how it is acquired, how it spreads from one stimulus to another, and how persistent it is. They concluded that emotional responses like fear are conditioned, are learned over time, often in childhood, sometimes in adulthood. I'm going to describe the study on the next few slides. Keep in mind that after they conditioned Albert to be afraid of different stimuli, they did not attempt to uncondition him. They didn't attempt to extinguish the fear. They left it as it was. Later that year, after they published their results, Watson ended up resigning from Johns Hopkins University. His wife had found out about his affair with Rayner and demanded that the university fire him. The university instead asked for his resignation, and Watson agreed. This is relevant because it contributes to the spread of behaviorism. This is relevant because the event contributed to the spread of behaviorism. I'm sure Watson's wife did not realize that her actions would indirectly impact the field of psychology, but it did. Watson eventually moves from academia, from Johns Hopkins University, into the business world, into marketing, and he takes his conditioning principles, his conditioning ideas with him, and has a big impact on the marketing field. Watson and Rosalie worked with a 9-month-old infant named Albert, and you can see him pictured here. Rosalie is the woman who is sitting directly behind Albert in this photo on the left. At first, Albert was only afraid of a loud noise. Nothing else bothered him. He wasn't afraid of the white rat. He wasn't afraid of the white furry coat. He was only afraid of the loud noise. Who wouldn't be? What child wouldn't be? After the rat and the noise were paired together over and over again, Albert began to fear the rat. He began to cry, as you can see in the image on the right. He began to cry every single time they put the rat next to him. The loud noise was not needed, was not required to induce this fear. One of the things that was surprising was that fear could be generalized to other similar stimuli that were never paired with the loud noise. After pairing the rat and the bunny together, Albert became afraid of even the bunny, as you can see here in the GIF. He eventually became afraid of Watson himself. Watson had white hair with glasses, and Albert associated Watson with the loud noise and probably with the white rat. There was a white fur coat. There were other furry objects that they placed with Albert and the rat. The loud noise was not needed to make Albert afraid of these other stimuli. Just being presented with the rat was enough for him to also begin to fear these other things that, remember, he did not fear in the beginning. Throughout the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, Watson promoted behaviorism using a variety of channels. He talked about it in speeches, in books, articles, magazines, radio broadcasts. He talked about behaviorism and his work everywhere he went. He was successful in part because American psychologists were ready for a more objective, scientific approach, something that didn't rely on introspection, something that was more practical. Plus, the American public had started to recognize how one's environment, how one's childhood can impact adulthood, can impact how they think and act later on in life. One of the other ways that Watson was able to spread the word about behaviorism was because he went from being a professor and researcher in academia to becoming an advertising executive. But this was really just one of the ways that Watson was able to bridge the gap between basic research in the lab and applied research in psychology. He studied behavior in the lab, but then he used the principles, the conclusions that he drew to try to address real world problems in a variety of different situations, much like the applied psychologists tried to do. The year after Watson resigned from Johns Hopkins University, he became an advertising executive at J. Walter Thompson and used his understanding of human behavior to help market some of their clients' products. I have a few examples of the things that he helped promote. These are not his deliverables, they're not his designs, but these are the brands and the products. Maxwell Coffee, Pond's Lotion, and Pepco toothpaste. One of his ads for the toothpaste presented a woman seductively smoking a cigarette. And his message was essentially that this toothpaste can help even women who smoke have beautiful white teeth. For the rest of his life, he worked in the advertising business and made several times more than he would have had he remained a professor. During his remaining years, he continued to promote behaviorism, write books, articles, give speeches, mentor other individuals, and apply psychology to the marketing of products. Now that you know more about what behaviorism is, how it got started, and two of its earliest contributors, I hope you are starting to see the connection between early psychology and modern psychology. Behaviorism is that bridge between the two. It is an important part of psychology. I hope that you enjoyed learning about Pavlov and Watson. Next week, in week 11, we're going to focus on B.F. Skinner and his operant conditioning principles.